Moments ago, President Trump told reporters that he will decide sometime tonight whether or not to fire his Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Dr. Tom Price. Price has been experiencing some, shall we say, turbulence after the press learned of his extensive use of private charter planes on the taxpayer's dime. CNN senior White House correspondent Jeff Zeleny joins me now. Jeff, I guess just the basic question, is Tom Price going to survive this?
Jake, it is very unlikely that Secretary Price will survive this. There are two options right now. He could resign and the president could accept that resignation, or he could be fired. I am told by officials here that the first option is more likely, that's likely what the president was referring to when he said there would be an announcement this evening. But Jake, the president made clear repeatedly, again and again, calling him a fine man. But I asked him specifically if he had lost confidence in his secretary. Let's watch.
Not a question of confidence. I was disappointed because I didn't like it, cosmetically or otherwise. I was disappointed. So I don't like to see somebody that perhaps there's the perception that it wasn't right. Well, I don't want to say, but we'll be announcing something today. We'll be announcing something today.
And Jake, just as soon as we said that, we do indeed have breaking news here that the Secretary, Tom Price, has indeed resigned. Just as we were told it would happen, that he would resign, I'm told the president is prepared, of course, to accept this resignation here. This, again, as we heard, was about optics, was about the whole idea of draining the swamp, saving taxpayers' money. Simply was not done in this case. The president was disappointed, was furious at him. He was also, of course, Tom Price was the longtime House member, the physician who was supposed to lead the health care reform effort. That, of course, failed. He never was able to get that off the ground, and either the House or the Senate did not play that big of a role. So he now has offered his resignation. He has resigned. And, of course, the president, we're expecting to accept that resignation. And, of course, the search, once again, Jake, begins for another senior advisor, a new member of the president's cabinet. Again, happening on a Friday, as we've seen so many of these before, Jake.
Well, Jeff Zeleny, just an example of how great your reporting is. You're there telling us that Tom Price is not going to survive, and literally as you're doing it, the White House press secretary is sending out a note, and let me just read this from the White House press secretary. Secretary of Health and Human Services Thomas Price offered his resignation earlier today, and the president accepted. The president intends to designate Don J. Wright of Virginia to serve as acting secretary, effective at 11:59 p.m. on September 29th. Mr. Wright currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. But let's keep talking about this for a second, Jeff, because this has been a lot of turbulence in this administration, a lot of resignations. I wasn't prepared for this, but I mean, just off the top of my head, we had the National Security Advisor, Anthony Scaramucci. We had Sebastian Gorka. He fired, of course, James Comey. He fired, we've had a number of communications director. In addition to Scaramucci, there was Mike Dubke. Who am I forgetting? Sean Spicer.
I mean, Steve Bannon, of course, the chief strategist, of course, the chief of staff, Reince Priebus. And it's important to point out, Jake, that all of these private flights, these charter flights, the issue here, it happened during the tenure of Reince Priebus as chief of staff. And there was a sense that the controls were not being as closely monitored here. But this is an example. The president is making an example of Tom Price here. In fact, he told us earlier when he was leaving the White House that there would be no more private flights at all. He added a caveat. He said, if you can afford your own plane, then that's fine. So that's what, ironically here, Secretary Price is a wealthy man by any measure. His net worth is upwards of $10 million or so. Not as wealthy as some other members of the cabinet who have their own fleets of planes or planes. So he was using taxpayer money for these private planes here, Jake. But you are right. This is a long list of advisors here. I would not put Tom Price in the higher echelon of someone the president listened to on a lot of matters, but he, of course, was an early supporter, and he was one of those members of Congress who was brought over to join the this administration, to be confirmed easily and to help get things through Congress. That simply has not happened at all here. So the president, as he left today, seemed like he was not sweating this too much, Jake. He wanted to, he said, look, he's a fine man, he's a nice man. Whenever you hear that on a Friday, it's a kiss of death.
All right, Jeff Zeleny, I'm going to let you make some phone calls and do some reporting and come back to us.
Sure.
If you're just tuning in, let me reiterate the news. We just got this from the White House press secretary. Secretary of Health and Human Services Thomas Price offered his resignation earlier today, and the president has accepted. The president intends to designate Don J. Wright of Virginia, who's the deputy assistant secretary, to serve as acting secretary effective at 11:59 p.m. This evening. We have lots to talk about with our panel. Amanda Carpenter, let me start with you. Price was trying desperately to do damage control on this, although he never did the number one rule in Washington, which is when there's a bad story, get out all the information, get it all out at once, be contrite, and get it out on your own terms. He let there be a drip, drip, drip. Politico has been working tirelessly on this story for days and days and days. First it was like one trip, then it was two trips. Pretty soon you have more than $1 million worth of these flights. And he was, by the way, never contrite.
Nope. Well, the lesson is also don't do it. I mean, as a conservative, I look at this and think, what an utter total waste. This guy knew better. He was chair of the Budget Committee. He was chair of the Republican Study Committee. He was chair of the Republican Policy Committee. He knew better, and conservatives expected him to be a fiscal conservative, but also, in this role, get to work on the regulations with Obamacare. This was the selling point of Tom Price. He's a physician. He'd been built up in Republican circles for so long, and you finally get the chance to do good in Washington, show that we can execute on the fiscal conservative stuff. And he starts getting on private jets the second he gets there. And you know when you're getting on a private jet, it's not like, oh, I just skipped the TSA line the last 14 times. You know how extravagant it is. All members of Congress do, because when they get one, it's a big deal. So it's sad, I'm angry, and I think Republicans in Washington better look at Tom Price and see how quickly they can blow the opportunity they have, because we're at the end of the year, nothing's getting done, and this is a big setback.
And Kirsten, let me just say, I thought it was so surprising when I heard he took a charter flight, a private jet, to Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia, so I go back and forth to Philadelphia all the time. I have never flown anything to Philadelphia. It is an hour and a half on a train.
He just had his driver take him there.
It's a 3-hour drive.
Yeah, I mean, truly, most cabinet secretaries have a car and driver, and he could have just driven if it really was, I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to catch a flight. But we all know, we live here, this is insane. Even if you wanted to fly, there are plenty of flights to take. You know what I mean? But most people take the train. You know, I go back and forth to New York every week for CNN. It's insane to even say something like that, to think anyone would fall for it. And I think that, you know, what he did is just inexplicable. I don't even understand, like you're saying, this isn't somebody who was new to Washington and didn't know the way things were done. He would know that that's not how things are done. It's not appropriate. It's extremely expensive. If you ever are using a private plane as a cabinet secretary, it's usually for international travel, which she did do some of it, but it's usually because you have all of your staff with you. You know what I mean?
The other thing is, if you're a national security official, a lot of times if you're in the FBI or the Attorney General or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, then people say, well,
sure,
there are
not
actually
the HHS secretary.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
that's like there's no reason that he needs to, you know. So I think that, you know, and even the thing with his wife, where it's not, he's saying he's going to reimburse for it, but it's sort of, since he won't say when he reimbursed, it sort of implies that he didn't, and that again is just a major no-no. You would never not reimburse for your spouse traveling on official travel.
And the other thing about the reimbursement, I got to go to Jeff Zeleny in one sec because he has some reporting, is yesterday when he said, I'll pay for the private, no taxpayer should have to pay for my seat. As opposed to pay for the flight.
Right.
And there's this crazy thing in Washington where they let people take a charter flight, and then the reimbursement is for the equivalent of a business class commercial flight, which is nothing like flying on a charter jet. Nothing like it. Let me go back to Jeff Zeleny, who's going to try to explain a little bit more about how this all played out. Jeff?
Well, Jake, really, in less than 24 hours time, I am told it became clear to Secretary Price that he had to leave. When he was leaving a Capitol Hill office building yesterday, he told one of our producers, Greg Wallace, who was out there talking to him, that he would absolutely stay on. Well, of course, after the latest round of stories about the military planes, was adding on to this last evening, even though that was approved by the White House, he was given word that he was not going to stay. So today, all day long, I am told that this is not coming as a surprise to the secretary. He knew that that this was coming, and you could certainly see it in the president's body language, that this was not something that he wrestled with, as he has done as Attorney General. If you think back to how the president deals with these things, often he will let his advisors sort of hang and be in this uncomfortable purgatory, if you will. That was not the case on this. I am told because the president was offended by it. But Jake, also he found what you were just talking about to be typical Washington. $52,000, paying that amount of money does not even begin to cover the amount of the jet fuel or anything else here. So the question we have tonight, Jake, that we've not yet got an answer, will Secretary Price, or former Secretary Price after midnight, will he still cut that check for $52,000? We don't know if he will or not. We'll have to see, Jake.
I would, well, I'm not going to guess. But let me ask you a question, Jeff. There are other people in the Trump administration who, it has been reported in the last week, flew on private charter jets, including the Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, the EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, and the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who's worth at least $300 million. Does this mean that these three individuals are also on the bubble, or does the administration just want to make a sacrificial lamb out of Price?
I do not believe that those three individuals are on the bubble. Ryan Zinke, the one who you mentioned at the beginning, he is the latest to come under fire on this. He was flying on something, again, that his office approved. The ethics office approved that he was flying from Las Vegas to his home in Montana, and he is being unapologetic at this point. He suggested that all of these reports were, in his words, BS, excuse my language, and he said that, look, these were appropriate flights. He was trying to get to a rural part of the country there. So I do not believe that any of these three are on the cusp like Tom Price, but I can tell you the president was pretty clear in saying that there will be no more private travel like this unless in unusual circumstances here. So I think Tom Price is, I guess, being made an example of, but he certainly had many, many more flights than all of these three other gentlemen combined.